There exists within the sacred tapestry of biblical history a series of books whose absence speaks louder than their inclusion ever could. The books of the Maccabees, nestled for centuries within ancient manuscripts and revered by some Christian traditions, have for many believers faded into obscurity. Their voices, once clear and resonant, now echo faintly across the margins of modern biblical canons. Why were they silenced? Why have their stories, so rich in courage and conviction, been withheld from so many faithful hearts? To ask this question is to embark on a journey that stretches far beyond literary curiosity. It reaches into the heart of faith itself, probing the boundaries of tradition, power, and the divine message meant to be shared. The absence of these texts from many Bibles is not a trivial omission. It is a wound in the continuity of sacred testimony, a silence that beckons explanation. Before the great expanse of the New Testament ever unfolded, and after the prophetic voices of the Old Testament had quieted, there came a time of struggle, of resilience, of hope forged in the fires of persecution. This was the era of the Maccabees. They were not kings nor prophets in the usual sense. They were warriors of conviction, leaders of a people determined not to be absorbed by the flood of foreign gods and customs. They stood when standing meant death. They spoke when silence was demanded. Their deeds shook empires and rekindled the spiritual flame of a nation. Why then are their accounts not found in every Christian Bible? Why do these records, which shine with divine inspiration and human bravery, not occupy a rightful place alongside the chronicles of Moses, David, and Paul? Could it be that what these books contain is not merely history, but a truth too piercing for comfort? A mirror held up to every age that dares to trade its soul for convenience. These are not rhetorical questions. They are vital to our understanding of what it means to hold a sacred text, to claim a divine narrative, to say that God still speaks. If something as profound as the Maccabean story has been omitted, what else have we lost? And what would it mean to rediscover it? The Maccabees were not simply warriors. They were preservers of identity, defenders of a covenant that many sought to dissolve. Their story is one of familial loyalty, national redemption, and unswerving faith under the most harrowing conditions. They chose the sword not for conquest, but for survival of the soul. Their victory was not political, but spiritual. A triumph over forgetting who they were. In the Psalms, it is written that the delight of the righteous is in the law of the Lord, and in that law they meditate day and night. Psalm 1 verse 2. What then does it mean when a part of that meditation is hidden? Can the soul still flourish on a diet of selective memory? Or is there something essential in the pages left unread, the stories untold, the heroes unacknowledged? Throughout history, voices have been silenced not because they were false, but because they were powerful. The books of the Maccabees are among those voices. They do not conform easily. They challenge. They demand a response. Perhaps that is why they were set aside, because they dared to call the faithful not just to believe, but to act, not just to pray, but to persevere, not just to accept, but to resist. This exploration begins not with an answer, but with a mystery, not with a declaration, but with a question that opens the door to a deeper truth. The silence surrounding the Maccabees is not merely historical, it is spiritual. It is the quiet before a storm of realization. And as we move forward, we do so not as passive readers, but as seekers, yearning to uncover what has been hidden, to hear what has been hushed, and to understand why. The fires of faith are not always kindled in times of peace. More often, they are ignited in the shadows of despair, when hope seems all but extinguished and the soul is tempted to yield. So it was in the days of the Maccabean Revolt, a time when the covenant between God and his people stood on the brink of obliteration. Not by sword alone, but by seduction, by cultural erasure, and by the slow corrosion of sacred identity. The land of Israel, once ruled by kings anointed by divine will, had become a province under the harsh shadow of the Seleucid Empire, a Greek dynasty whose ambitions extended far beyond conquest of territory. The aim was not merely to subjugate, but to assimilate, to erase the unique heartbeat of the Jewish people and replace it with the rhythms of Hellenistic thought, customs, and gods. It was an assault not just on sovereignty, but on sanctity, and the most devastating blow came not on the battlefield, but in the temple itself. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, a name that would forever be etched in the annals of infamy, desecrated the sacred heart of Jerusalem. The holy altar, once a place of divine communion, was defiled with offerings to Zeus. Swine, an animal abhorrent to Jewish law, were slaughtered where once had risen the smoke of pure sacrifices. Scrolls of the Torah were torn and burned, and any who clung to their commandments were hunted like criminals. It was not enough to conquer the land. Antiochus sought to conquer the soul. Yet history does not always bend to the will of tyrants. In a small village called Modane, a priest named Mattathias refused to bow. When ordered to offer a pagan sacrifice, he struck down the official and fled into the hills with his 5 sons, kindling the spark of rebellion. This defiance was not rooted in political ambition. It was a cry from the depths of the covenantal heart, a refusal to forget who they were and whose name they bore. From this act of resistance emerged Judas Maccabeus, the son who would become a leader of legend. Known as the Hammer, he forged an army not with the might of numbers or the wealth of kingdoms, but with the indomitable will of a people who remembered the Exodus, remembered Sinai, remembered Zion. His warriors trained in the wilderness, lived by the law, and struck with the precision of divine purpose. Each battle was more than a military engagement. It was a declaration that the God of Israel still reigned. The odds were absurd. The Seleucid armies were vast, disciplined, and well-equipped, while the Maccabees were few, poorly armed, and hunted. Yet they prevailed, again and again. They fought not for expansion, but for restoration, not to build an empire, but to cleanse the sanctuary. Every victory was a hymn to a God who honors faith more than force. The climactic moment came with the recapture of the temple. It had been defiled, its sanctity poisoned by idols and pagan rituals. Judas and his followers wept as they beheld the devastation, yet their grief did not paralyze them. They tore down the profaned altar, cleansed the sanctuary, and erected a new one with stones untouched by idolatry. The lampstand was rekindled, though oil remained for only a single night. And yet, as tradition tells us, the flame endured for 8, an echo of divine favor, a whisper of the miraculous in a world overrun by the cruel logic of power. That event became the foundation for Hanukkah, not merely as a festival of light, but as a testimony to the resilience of the sacred. It is not just a celebration of survival, but of spiritual resistance, the kind that refuses to let the divine be forgotten, the kind that dares to believe that holiness can be restored, even in the ashes of desecration. This was not just a revolt, it was a revival. The Maccabean uprising reasserted the sacred narrative in a world that sought to write it out of existence. It was a testament to the enduring relevance of divine law, of identity forged in covenant, and of worship that cannot be extinguished by decree. It is easy to admire the bravery of warriors. More difficult is to grasp the depth of conviction required to risk everything not for territory, but for Torah. The Maccabees chose the hard road of remembrance when forgetting would have brought ease. They embraced exile, poverty, and war rather than compromise with the culture of their oppressors. In this way, their story speaks not just to their time, but to all times where faith is tested and truth must be fought for. They carried more than swords, they carried a legacy. And in cleansing the temple, they reminded the world that the presence of God does not reside in stone alone, but in the hearts of those who refuse to surrender what is holy. Between the final echoes of the Old Testament prophets and the first cries recorded in the Gospels lies a stretch of time often described as silent. This era, spanning roughly 4 centuries, is frequently depicted as a spiritual void, a waiting room between revelation and fulfillment. The prophets had spoken, the law had been given, the covenant had been broken and renewed again and again. Then suddenly, the narrative seems to halt. No new scriptures, no recognized prophetic voices, no divine interventions are formally chronicled in most Christian canons. And yet, to call this a period of silence is to overlook a time rich with transformation, suffering, hope, and profound theological development. This so-called intertestamental period was not marked by passivity or absence. It was a crucible. Empires rose and fell, cultures collided. The identity of the Jewish people was tested and reshaped under pressures both external and internal. During these centuries, the land of Israel passed from Persian hands to Greek control, endured the brutal reign of the Seleucids, and eventually came under Roman dominion. Each shift brought new threats to the distinctiveness of the Jewish faith, each regime another attempt to dilute or eradicate what set them apart. Amidst this turbulence, the books of the Maccabees emerged as voices that refused to be stilled. They were not alone. Other writings surfaced during this time, including works of wisdom, apocalyptic vision, and historical chronicle. But the Maccabean texts stood out for their raw portrayal of faith under fire. They captured a theological current that ran strong beneath the surface of history, one that would later rise again in the teachings and mission of Jesus of Nazareth. To speak of silence during this period is not to deny that voices were raised, only that they were later quieted by exclusion. The Christian canon, particularly in its Protestant form, largely bypasses this era. The pages of Malachi are followed swiftly by those of Matthew, as if nothing of spiritual consequence occurred in the interim. But in truth, the themes that would shape the New Testament were already stirring, quietly, defiantly, in the shadows of persecution and revival. The books of the Maccabees function not as peripheral additions, but as a theological bridge. They carry forward the thread of covenantal loyalty, of divine justice, of resurrection hope. They contain prayers and reflections that echo earlier psalms and anticipate later teachings. In 2 Maccabees, for instance, there is a striking affirmation of life after death, a belief in the resurrection of the righteous that would later become central to Christian doctrine. This is not mere coincidence, but continuity. The God who vindicated the martyrs of the Maccabean era is the same God whose power raised Christ from the tomb. Moreover, the Maccabean texts offer a portrait of messianic expectation that helps explain the atmosphere of the Gospels. The longing for deliverance, the yearning for a leader who would restore righteousness and break the yoke of foreign rule is palpable in these writings. By the time Jesus began his ministry, these expectations had matured, been shaped by generations of waiting and watching. To understand that climate, one must look not only at Isaiah or Daniel, but at the writings that filled the so-called gap. The silence, then, is not divine but editorial. It reflects a choice made by communities and councils generations later to include or exclude, to emphasize or ignore. The absence of these books from certain Bibles does not mean they lacked influence. They shaped the thought world of the Second Temple period. They informed the spiritual imagination of those who awaited the Messiah. They were read, revered, and remembered by many, even as others sought to erase their voice from the official record. One cannot help but wonder what was lost when these texts were set aside. Not merely stories, but a sense of continuity. Not only history, but the lived theology of a people who did not give up when the heavens seemed closed. These were the years when faith was tested not by divine silence, but by human cruelty, and the response was not despair, but defiance rooted in devotion. To stand in this intertestamental space is to realize that revelation does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through suffering. It speaks in courage. It is carried not in tablets of stone, but in the memory of martyrs and the resolve of the faithful. The Maccabees help us hear that voice. They fill in the space that others have called empty. They prove that God was not absent. He was simply speaking through those who had ears to hear and hands willing to act. The formation of what is now called the biblical canon was not the outcome of a single decision, nor was it dictated by divine inscription etched in stone for all to accept without question. Instead, it was a long and complex process shaped by councils, convictions, cultural pressures, and competing theological priorities. It was a human effort, sometimes careful, sometimes political, always consequential. At its heart lies the uncomfortable truth that inclusion and exclusion were not solely determined by spiritual insight, but also by human choice. And among the casualties of those choices were the books of the Maccabees. To understand how sacred texts could be both preserved and silenced, one must begin not with the printing press or the Protestant Reformation, but far earlier in the shifting sands of early Christianity and late Judaism. In the centuries following the Maccabean Revolt, Jewish communities in different regions developed slightly different collections of sacred writings. The Hebrew-speaking Jews of Palestine tended to favor a narrower collection, while Greek-speaking Jews of the diaspora, particularly in Alexandria, preserved a broader library of spiritual and historical texts, including the Maccabean books, translated into the Greek Septuagint. This Greek version would prove profoundly influential, not just for Hellenistic Jews, but for early Christians who spoke and wrote primarily in Greek. The Septuagint became, for many of them, the Bible. It was the version most frequently quoted in the New Testament writings, the version most accessible to the rapidly expanding Gentile church. It included texts that the Palestinian Jewish tradition might have viewed with hesitation or considered useful but not inspired, and among these were the books of the Maccabees. As Christianity began to define itself, not merely as a Jewish sect, but as a distinct faith with its own theological identity, the question of which texts were to be considered authoritative became urgent. This was not merely a matter of doctrine, but one of identity and survival. In times of persecution, believers clung to certain writings as lifelines. In times of growth and organization, leaders sought to solidify teachings and protect against heresy. And so lists began to appear. Councils were convened, debates ensued, not just over the Maccabees, but over Hebrews, Revelation, the Shepherd of Hermas, and more. It was not until the late 4th century, at councils such as those held in Hippo and Carthage, that a more settled canon emerged within the Western Church. These councils affirmed a list that included the books of the Maccabees, aligning with the usage that had already taken root across the Catholic world. The Orthodox Church, with its own conciliar traditions and spiritual sensibilities, also maintained these books within its sacred texts. For these traditions, the Maccabean narratives were not secondary. They were scripture, historically vital, spiritually profound, and theologically rich. But this consensus would not last. Centuries later, in the crucible of the Protestant Reformation, the question of the canon was reignited with new intensity. Reformers, driven by a desire to return to what they saw as the purity of the original scriptures, turned away from the broader canon of the Latin Church and sought to align more closely with the Hebrew Bible as defined by Rabbinic Judaism. The result was the exclusion of several books found in the Septuagint but absent from the Masoretic text, including the Maccabees. The reasons were not purely linguistic or historical. The Maccabees posed challenges to certain emerging theological positions. Their affirmation of intercessory prayer for the dead, for instance, supported doctrines like purgatory, which the Reformers rejected. Their emphasis on works of faithfulness and sacrificial endurance ran counter to certain readings of grace and justification that were becoming central to Protestant thought. And their association with what was increasingly viewed as Catholic liturgical tradition made them suspect in the eyes of those seeking a stark break from Rome. Over time, these choices solidified. Protestant Bibles were printed without the Maccabees, or with them relegated to the status of apocrypha, a word that carries the weight of marginalization, suggesting these books are helpful perhaps, but not divinely inspired. Meanwhile, Catholic and Orthodox communities continued to read, honor, and draw theological insight from them. What had once been a shared testimony now became a dividing line. What does this say about the nature of sacred text? Who decides what is holy and on what grounds? Is a book less inspired because a council deemed it so, or more sacred because tradition upheld it? The process by which the canon was formed reminds us that what we call scripture is not always what was preserved by God alone, but what was also chosen by people, some guided by deep discernment, others by necessity or pressure. The books of the Maccabees were hidden not because they lacked power, but perhaps because they held too much. They spoke of spiritual rebellion in the face of worldly authority, of miracles that occurred outside the accepted prophetic framework, of a God who honors faithfulness even when it arises beyond the boundaries of established institutions. Their silence in some traditions is not a judgment on their truth, but a window into the shaping of Christian identity across centuries of conflict, reform, and renewal. In uncovering this history, we are not merely retracing ancient decisions. We are confronting the ongoing tension between what is received and what is revealed, between tradition and transformation. And we are invited once again to ask what it means to treat a book as holy, and who has the right to make that claim. Within the pages of 2nd Maccabees lies a narrative so harrowing and yet so profoundly moving that it has echoed through centuries of spiritual contemplation, etched into the collective memory of those who revere not only the triumphs of faith, but its ultimate sacrifices. Among these, the story of the mother and her 7 sons stands as one of the most visceral testimonies to the cost of fidelity to divine law and the promise of life that transcends death. This account is not framed with sentimentality. It does not soften the horror of what transpired under the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, whose campaign to erase Jewish identity included brutal torture and execution of those who refused to abandon the commandments. One by one, each son was offered a chance to live, if only he would eat pork, a simple act outwardly insignificant, but one that symbolized a deep betrayal of the covenant. None relented, each stood firm, enduring agony with words that proclaimed hope in resurrection and trust in divine justice. The mother, unnamed yet unforgettable, does not weep in despair, but speaks to her sons with a strength that seems to surpass human endurance. Her voice, steady in the face of unspeakable grief, articulates a theology that would later be echoed in Christian martyrdom and sharpened in the crucible of early church persecution. She reminds her sons that it is not man who grants life and death, but God who creates and will restore. Her courage is not merely maternal, but prophetic. She does not shield her children from suffering, but shepherds them through it, offering them a vision beyond the grave. This scene, preserved not in mainstream Protestant Bibles but in the pages of the 2nd Maccabees, contains themes that would later become foundational for Christian theology. The belief in the resurrection of the righteous, explicitly voiced by the young martyrs, anticipates the Christian affirmation that death is not the end for those who belong to God. Their hope is not abstract, it is pointed and personal. They declare, even in torment, that their bodies may perish, but their souls will be raised by the one who made all things. Such convictions did not remain confined to the Jewish resistance. As the early Christians faced the wrath of Rome, as they were dragged into arenas and burned in courtyards, the memory of the Maccabean martyrs gave shape and substance to their own suffering. These stories were not forgotten. They were read aloud, invoked in homilies, and used to instruct the faithful in the meaning of steadfastness. For the early church, martyrdom was not a tragic failure, but a victory, a visible testimony that the kingdom of God could not be silenced by fear or extinguished by death. The parallels with Jesus Christ are unmistakable. He too refused to compromise, stood silent before accusations, embraced suffering for the sake of a greater redemption. In the Gospels, his path to Calvary echoes the lonely procession of those who chose death over disobedience. The theology that undergirds Christian soteriology, salvation through suffering, vindication through resurrection, finds its prototype in the blood-soaked pages of the Maccabean texts. What these martyrs teach is not merely the glory of dying for one's beliefs. Their message is deeper, rooted in a profound trust that God not only sees injustice, but will one day reverse it. Their hope is not escape, but restoration. They are willing to suffer because they believe that the arc of divine history bends not toward oblivion, but toward renewal. Their story is a refusal to accept that brute force has the final word. In this way, the books of the Maccabees do more than preserve historical memory. They articulate a theology that speaks to every generation tempted to forsake faith for ease. They confront readers with the uncomfortable reality that true allegiance may demand everything. And they offer, in the face of that demand, the promise that nothing offered in faith is ever lost. Eternal reward in this context is not a vague consolation. It is a certainty that reshapes how suffering is understood. The martyrs do not die as victims, but as witnesses. Their deaths are not voids, but declarations. And their courage reverberates in every believer who dares to live as if resurrection were not just a doctrine, but a destiny. Silence in the hands of power is not passive. It is not simply the absence of sound, nor the unintentional forgetting of history. Silence can be constructed. It can be engineered with precision, maintained with determination, and justified with rhetoric that cloaks suppression in the garments of tradition. When certain voices are consistently left unread, when certain texts are quietly removed from the liturgical rhythm of worship, or when entire histories are made to seem peripheral, the question must be asked: who benefits from this silence? The books of the Maccabees carry within them a message that is deeply unsettling to systems built on control. They do not merely recount a historical revolt. They speak of the sacred right to resist. They depict ordinary individuals who reject forced assimilation, who rise not as conquerors, but as defenders of covenantal truth, and who do so without the permission of institutional authority. They elevate the power of conscience, the authority of divine law over imperial decree, and the idea that fidelity to God may require open defiance of rulers. For those who govern by demanding religious conformity or social compliance, these themes are not inspirational. They are dangerous. It is no coincidence that the books of the Maccabees were embraced in times and places where the struggle for religious identity was acute, and minimized when institutions sought stability through uniformity. In ancient empires where gods were tools of statecraft and religious expression was regulated by political need, stories of spiritual rebellion had the potential to undermine the delicate balance of control. The Maccabean Revolt was not just a threat to Hellenistic power, it was a blueprint for how the oppressed could reclaim their voice through divine allegiance. This subversive potential did not vanish in antiquity. As the Church grew in influence, moving from a persecuted minority to a pillar of imperial order, its relationship with sacred texts became more cautious, more calculated. The desire to establish orthodoxy, to unify belief, to prevent dissent from destabilizing the fragile unity of Christendom, these were understandable motivations. But they also created a context in which books that celebrated autonomous resistance and martyrdom outside official ecclesiastical sanction were viewed with suspicion. The Maccabees did not receive divine instruction through sanctioned prophets. They were not priests ordained by any central authority. Their authority arose from the clarity of conscience and the urgency of faith. This autonomy, this spiritual independence, runs counter to the hierarchical structures that would later dominate Christian governance. It suggests that divine truth can emerge from outside the approved channels, that holiness can be preserved by those unrecognized by the institutional center. For a church increasingly bound to empire, such implications were not merely theological, they were political. Even within the context of the Reformation, which challenged centralized power and reclaimed the principle of individual conscience, the books of the Maccabees posed complications. Their supportive practices like prayer for the dead clashed with emerging Protestant doctrines. Their portrayal of works and martyrdom clashed with emphases on faith alone. Their association with Catholic liturgy made them suspect in the eyes of reformers eager to purify their scriptural foundation. As a result, theological disagreements were not merely debated, they were edited into the canon itself. This editorial act, this decision to exclude, was not framed as suppression. It was defended as fidelity, presented as a return to original sources. Yet the outcome remained. Stories of resistance were silenced in the name of order. Texts that emboldened the faithful to challenge unjust rule were quietly set aside. And in doing so, the canon ceased to reflect the full breadth of spiritual struggle and narrowed the imagination of what faithfulness could look like. Silence became a means of protection, not for the vulnerable, but for the status quo. By eliminating narratives that empowered defiance, institutions insulated themselves from critique. They curated a history that emphasized obedience, humility, and submission, while obscuring those moments when divine fidelity demanded confrontation, risk, and even rebellion. The Maccabees were not forgotten by accident. They were hidden by design, and yet the texts remain. Preserved in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, studied in academic circles, whispered in the traditions of the faithful who still draw strength from their witness. The books of the Maccabees defy their silencing. Their message persists, that there are moments when the sacred demands resistance, when cultural assimilation must be rejected not out of pride but out of reverence, and when the path of righteousness leads not to applause but to exile. In a world where power still prefers docility, where truth is often curated for comfort, the story of the Maccabees calls believers to remember that the divine voice does not always speak through the throne or the temple. Sometimes it speaks through the defiant cry of those who kneel not to man, but to God alone. Despite the absence of the books of the Maccabees from most Protestant Bibles, their voice has never been entirely extinguished. In the liturgical and theological traditions of both the Catholic and Orthodox churches, these texts have not only been preserved, but cherished. They have formed part of the spiritual bloodstream of millions of believers across generations, shaping the contours of worship, doctrine, and devotion in ways that are both subtle and profound. For these communities, the Maccabean narratives are not treated as peripheral. They are woven into the rhythm of sacred reading, recited during times of liturgical reflection, and presented as examples of unwavering faith in the face of persecution. Their inclusion is not arbitrary, nor is it anachronistic. Rather, it arises from a deep recognition that these stories articulate truths about God's faithfulness and the human response to divine calling that remain as relevant today as they were in antiquity. Within the Catholic tradition, the Maccabees hold a unique place, particularly in the liturgical calendar. and in the development of key doctrines. The second book, with its passionate account of the seven brothers and their mother, serves as a powerful theological resource in discussions about the resurrection, the value of redemptive suffering, and the communion of saints. These themes find their echo in the celebration of All Souls' Day, in the prayers offered for the faithful departed, and in the Church's understanding of the bond that unites the living and the dead within the body of Christ. Far from being viewed as a historical oddity, the Maccabean witness is drawn into the ongoing spiritual life of the Church, nourishing the faithful with its vivid proclamation of hope and divine justice. The Orthodox Church, with its deep emphasis on tradition and continuity, likewise upholds the Maccabees with reverence. The Eastern liturgical cycle commemorates the Maccabean martyrs with solemnity, recognizing them not merely as precursors, but as true saints, whose lives reflect the spiritual DNA of the Church. Their feast, celebrated in some Orthodox calendars on August 1st, is not a symbolic nod, but a robust affirmation of their place within the communion of the holy. Icons depict their suffering and glory, hymns recount their bravery, their memory is not silenced, it is celebrated. What is particularly striking is how these traditions perceive the Maccabean texts not as isolated records of Jewish resistance, but as integral components of a broader divine narrative. They see in these stories the foreshadowing of the Paschal mystery, the spiritual fortitude of the martyrs anticipating the cross, and the purifying fire of tribulation preparing the world for redemption. The books of the Maccabees, in this light, do not merely belong to history, they belong to the mystery of God's enduring presence among His people. By preserving these texts, the Catholic and Orthodox churches offer a fuller, more textured view of salvation history. They resist the temptation to flatten the biblical witness into a linear progression from law to gospel. Instead, they embrace the complexity, the tension, the costly faith that bridges the testaments. The Maccabees stand at that bridge, not as anomalies, but as vital links between covenant and fulfillment, between promise and realization. Their presence testifies to the continuity of divine action, a God who does not abandon His people even in their darkest hour. Moreover, the spiritual impact of these texts extends beyond formal theology. In monasteries and homes, in catechesis and personal devotion, the Maccabean martyrs inspire courage and constancy. Their stories offer consolation to those who suffer for their convictions, a mirror for those wrestling with the cost of discipleship. In places where faith is still threatened, where believers must choose between comfort and conviction, these ancient words offer not just memory, but direction. They become a spiritual compass pointing toward truth, no matter the price. The decision of the Catholic and Orthodox churches to retain the Maccabees is not merely an historical artifact. It is a theological affirmation that God's voice has never been confined to the boundaries of one tradition or era. It is a recognition that the Spirit breathes through every act of faithful resistance, and that holiness often emerges where the world least expects it. By holding on to these texts, these traditions have preserved not only stories, but the very heartbeat of a faith that dares to believe in resurrection, in justice, in the triumph of the unseen. They have kept alive a voice that others tried to quiet, a voice that still speaks with the clarity of courage and the resonance of truth. The sacred narrative has never unfolded as a straightforward march through time. It weaves through the fabric of history with patterns and echoes, drawing connections between seemingly disparate moments, revealing that the divine plan is not merely announced by prophets in dramatic declarations, but also whispered through events, through people, and through struggle. Within the books of the Maccabees, one finds not only the record of a national revolt, but also a profound spiritual architecture that foreshadows the coming of the Messiah, a framework of themes and symbols that resonate deeply with the mission, ministry, and ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ. The motif of liberation stands at the forefront of the Maccabean narrative. The revolt, led by Judas Maccabeus, was not born from a thirst for political dominance or imperial expansion, but from a fierce determination to reclaim the freedom to worship, to live in accordance with divine law, and to preserve the identity of a people consecrated to God. This liberation was not framed as a quest for autonomy alone, but as an act of spiritual fidelity. It was an uprising not against mere rulers, but against forces that sought to replace the sacred with the profane. In this fight for religious freedom, one begins to hear a faint echo of Christ's own mission, liberating not through violence, but through truth, confronting not empires of stone, but the deeper tyranny of sin. Where the Maccabees wielded swords to purge the temple of idol worship and re-establish purity, Christ entered the temple in Jerusalem centuries later and drove out the money changers, calling attention to the corruption that had taken root in what was meant to be a house of prayer. Both actions centered on the sacred space, not simply as a physical location, but as a symbol of communion between God and humanity. In both accounts, the temple is not merely cleansed, it is reclaimed. And this act of reclamation points beyond the physical to the spiritual, preparing hearts to recognize a greater purification to come, one not achieved by ritual alone, but by the presence of the Holy One himself. The theme of sacrifice courses through the Maccabean texts, not in the form of ritual offerings, but through lives willingly laid down in devotion to the covenant. The martyrs, and particularly the mother and her 7 sons, embody a theology of redemptive suffering that finds its fullest expression in the Passion of Christ. These individuals did not die for abstract principles. They died to uphold the sanctity of God's law, trusting that their faithfulness would not end in annihilation, but in vindication. Their suffering, like Christ's, was not a sign of defeat, but a testimony to the victory of truth over terror. Moreover, the Maccabean vision of kingship, seen in Judas Maccabeus as a leader, raised not by lineage, but by divine calling, offers a prototype of messianic expectation that would later be redefined in the person of Jesus. Judas did not claim a throne through succession. He earned leadership through faith and action, embodying a form of divine kingship that emphasized righteousness, justice, and the restoration of sacred order. This model prepared the soil for a Messiah who would also subvert traditional notions of power, who would reign not through conquest but through sacrifice, whose crown would be one of thorns before it became one of glory. Even the celebration of Hanukkah, born from the rededication of the temple, bears symbolic weight that prefigures the light Christ would bring into the world. That small, flickering flame that miraculously endured becomes a metaphor for the light that shines in the darkness, which the darkness cannot overcome. The Maccabean victory was marked not just by physical restoration, but by a spiritual renewal that invited reflection on God's ongoing involvement in history. This same thread runs through the Gospels, where Jesus fulfills not only prophecies spoken, but also patterns lived, embodying in his flesh the hopes and struggles of those who came before. It is no wonder, then, that early Christians, many of whom were intimately familiar with the wider scriptural traditions, including the books of the Maccabees, saw in these stories more than historical resonance. They saw foreshadowings, precursors to a greater redemption, signposts that pointed forward to the culmination of God's plan in Christ. The suffering of the faithful, the cleansing of the sacred, the assertion of divine kingship, and the vindication of the righteous were all themes that prepared hearts to understand the deeper meaning of the cross and the empty tomb. These parallels are not coincidences, they are revelations in motion. They show that God's redemptive work is not bound by chapter divisions or testament titles. It unfolds through lives lived in fidelity, through history marked by resistance and renewal, and through sacred texts that, even when silenced, continue to speak. The books of the Maccabees are not merely ancient accounts. They are living testimonies of divine intention, woven into the prophetic tapestry that points unerringly to the Messiah. To rediscover the books of the Maccabees is not to dust off relics of a distant past or engage in mere academic curiosity. It is to unlock a spiritual current that still flows with urgency and power. These texts, often overlooked or dismissed, contain a vitality that transcends their historical setting. They are not frozen in time. They are alive with meaning, resonating in every soul that has wrestled with fear, with compromise, with the temptation to yield when everything sacred is under siege. For the modern believer, the trials may not come in the form of imperial decrees or physical persecution. Instead, they may arrive more subtly, through the slow erosion of conviction, the pressure to conform, the fatigue of defending what is holy in a world that has grown numb to the sacred. In such a climate, the voice of the Maccabees breaks through like a trumpet blast. It reminds the reader that courage is not a luxury reserved for the exceptional, but a necessity demanded of all who would be faithful. These books do not speak in abstractions. They speak in blood, in ashes, in the unwavering words of those who stood when standing meant pain, and who believed when believing seemed futile. The language is not always comfortable. It confronts, it challenges, it reveals the cost of fidelity, not to shame, but to strengthen. In a world flooded with noise, they cut through with a voice that is both ancient and astonishingly immediate. Rediscovering this voice means more than reading forgotten chapters. It means allowing them to read us, to expose where we have grown silent when we should speak, passive when we should act, compromised when we should remain rooted. The Maccabees do not merely offer moral examples, they offer spiritual mirrors. They reflect the condition of every heart that longs to be faithful but is pulled by fear, seduced by comfort, or worn down by disappointment. This voice calls especially to those in positions of quiet suffering. The individual who endures ridicule for their beliefs, the one who feels alone in a culture that no longer honors sacred truth, the soul weary of resisting compromise, all find themselves addressed in the bold declarations and solemn sacrifices of the Maccabean faithful. Their strength becomes shared, their courage becomes contagious, their faith becomes a torch passed forward, not extinguished by time, but kept alight in the hearts of those who dare to carry it. Moreover, these books remind the Church, across all traditions, that history is not only preserved in doctrine and liturgy, but also in memory and conviction. They challenge communities of faith to reconsider what they have left behind and why. Was it mere oversight that silenced these testimonies, or a discomfort with the questions they raise? In returning to these texts, the Church does not betray its heritage. It deepens it. It expands its understanding of what it means to walk in covenant, to suffer for righteousness, to hope in the face of death. Rediscovery is not about novelty. It is about restoration. It is about hearing again what was once heard clearly, allowing forgotten truths to shape present convictions. When the Maccabees spoke, they spoke not only for their generation, but for all who would one day find themselves at the crossroads of faith and fear. Their words are not locked in an era. They rise whenever the soul is called to remember who it is and whose it is. To hold these books in one's hands is to touch the fire of unbroken faith. It is to be reminded that even when the world seems ruled by those who mock holiness, there are still voices that cry out in defiance, not for personal glory, but for the glory of the one who sees in secret and rewards in eternity. Their voice, once forgotten, now rises again, not by force, but by invitation, not through spectacle, but through quiet strength. It speaks to every generation willing to listen, and in listening to be changed. There are truths that wait patiently to be remembered. They do not disappear. They do not lose their strength. They endure, like a buried ember beneath layers of ash, until the moment comes when someone stirs the flame again. The books of the Maccabees are such a truth. Their silence was never a sign of their insignificance. Their absence was not a judgment on their worth. They were meant to be known, and perhaps it is now more than ever that their voice must be heard again. Throughout this journey, we have seen that the Maccabees were not merely figures of the past, frozen in a moment of historical resistance. They were vessels of a deeper message, a divine echo of courage, conviction, and uncompromising faith. Their story did not end when the temple was rededicated. It did not fade with the last word of the second book. Their story is a thread, woven through the fabric of spiritual struggle across centuries, speaking with urgency to every soul that finds itself confronted by the cost of truth. In a world that often measures worth by ease and popularity, the Maccabees remind us that faithfulness is not always comfortable. They call us to remember that divine purpose rarely aligns with human convenience. They call out to the one standing alone in a workplace where integrity is mocked, to the teenager who refuses to conform when peers demand compromise, to the parent teaching their child what is right in a world that increasingly forgets. These books were silenced not because they lacked power, but because they held too much of it, the kind of power that emboldens the weak, awakens the slumbering, and confronts the comfortable. You were meant to know this. You were meant to know that spiritual courage is not extinct, that resistance to injustice, when rooted in righteousness, is an act of worship. That when you feel the pressure to surrender what is holy in exchange for what is easy, you are not alone. You are walking a path worn by saints and martyrs, by those who chose to honor the sacred rather than hide from the cost. You were meant to see that the silence surrounding these books was never benign. It was a silence with intent, a silence chosen, guarded, and passed down. But you were also meant to break it. By opening these pages, by receiving their testimony, by letting their fire ignite your own, you are part of something greater than rediscovery. You are part of restoration. The Maccabees speak of a God who does not abandon his people, even in exile, even in torment. They remind us that holiness can survive in the wilderness, that the divine does not vanish when temples fall, and that truth whispered in secret can one day shatter the silence of an age. You were meant to hear their voice, because their voice is the voice of all who have dared to believe when believing had a price. Let this be a call, not just to admiration, but to action. Open the texts, read them, share them. Let their testimony become part of your own. Let their defiance against assimilation become your strength in the face of compromise. Let their faith under fire remind you that divine promises are not broken by time, nor dimmed by distance. And as you carry this message forward, remember that you are not only reclaiming forgotten books, you are reclaiming a piece of the sacred story that was always meant to be yours. If this message stirred something in you, do not let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss these deeper explorations into the forgotten voices of Scripture. Like this video to let others know that this truth matters. Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear how the books of the Maccabees speak to your journey. And above all, share this video with someone who needs courage, who needs hope, who needs to remember that they are not alone in their faith. Thank you for watching.